COVID-19, where we were stand after 1 year. So I think we have completed 1 year on COVID, and what we have learned, what experience that we have gained from this 1 year. So I don't have any financial disclosure for today's talk, but I mean, this is very important disclosure that, I mean, this is rapidly changing science. So we need to keep ourselves updated, and what is acceptable today or what we discussed that this could be the pathogenesis or this could be the treatment of choice, which may not be true tomorrow, because there are several publications, they are floating into the PubMeds every day, right? So this may change the science, or this may change what we discuss today as the evidence, which may not be a good evidence tomorrow, right? So let me summarize. Like, at the end of 1 year, like, I can definitely tell you that we could understand in a better way the pathogenesis of COVID infection, what are the important target organs that is involved with the COVID, and what are the important complications, right? So, I mean, we are absolutely clear. So we do have good clarity, the mechanism of damage produced by the COVID-19 viral infections. We are also confident about diagnosis, because initially, like, there were several dilemma because of the sensitivity of RT-PCR tests initially, which was around 66 to 70%, but it was very specific, but the sensitivity was low. So this was a point of discussion that we are missing large number of patients. Then the antigen testing come. And we also, I mean, discuss a lot that the sensitivity of antigen testing is very poor, like it is around 50%. So it is less than the RT-PCR. And later on, like I mean, we are now well acclaimed with the two diagnostic modalities. Then lately, the antibody-based tests come, and initially, like, I mean, we were not, I mean, happy with the antibody results because of the not good the validations of the antibodies IgG as well as the IgM and the total antibodies against the SARS-CoV-2 by the various companies. But now we do have validated kits. So now we get the reliable antibodies. And these antibodies are extremely important, especially when you are dealing a post-COVID status or the patient who has undiagnosed inflammatory conditions and no passes of COVID. So these two tests are very important tests, apart from looking at the seroprevalence into the community, or to assess the efficacy of the vaccinations. So we are now very confident about the diagnostic modalities that we have for the COVID-19 infection. The another initial dilemma, or the discussion point, was about the transmission, how this virus transmitted from one person to another person. So now, I mean, we are very much confident and we have adequate clarity about the mode of transmission. We also discuss a lot about the seasonal variation, that winter may aggravate the spread of the disease and the summer may, I mean, but now it is very much clear that there is no significant seasonal the transmission variation. So it is round the year, and it mainly depends on the gathering or the closeness, right? So there is no seasonal variation. So now we are also clear. Initially, we do speculate that in winter months we may expect very high the patient's load, but now we are very much clear that there is no significant seasonal variations. The another discussion point during initial period was like the how long the virus will survive on the various surfaces, especially the cardboard, the wooden, the metal, the copper surface. So we try to, I mean, cheese out many papers, many publications. They were telling about the virus survival, that it survived for 16 hours, it survives for 3 days. And I mean, fear to touch the patient's X-ray, CT scan, or the reports that probably this surface may carry a virus and we may accidentally get infected. But now we are extremely confident that, I mean, these surfaces are not playing a significant role in transmission. Now we are, I mean, routinely like handling a patients, looking at the CT scan, X-ray reports, prescribing, we are looking at, we are reading the laboratory reports. So there is no, I mean, panicky, or even the newspapers. Like I remember that in Ahmedabad, the newspapers were, I mean, the newspaper vendors were not, I mean, giving a newspapers to house, like because of the fear that this may spread COVID infections. So I think, I mean, with initial this, the jerks, like now we are very much confident and we are not worried about how long the virus is going to survive on the surfaces. And the last important, the point which was, I mean, discussed amongst the medical practitioners was airborne transmission, because there were several studies which says that there is a possible airborne transmission. And this was a big concern, especially in the ICU. And the most important thing is that it was the concern about not giving BiPAP or not giving a nebulized therapy to patient who requires nebulized therapy, or the hypoxic patient who requires a BiPAP therapy. But now I think most of the hospital, they are confident, and they are providing all the nebulizer when the patient needs nebulizer therapy, or they, simply put them on BiPAP machine when they require the BiPAP support for their hypoxia. Now coming to the very important topic that we are going to discuss little in detail, and that is treatment. Let me summarize this point in treatment. One important thing is that there is no progress in antiviral, right? So still we are, struggling to have a good and potent antiviral for treatment of SARS-CoV-2 infection. We have understood the pathogenesis as well as the pathology of SARS-CoV-2 infections, and especially the inflammatory process. So now we do have a better understanding and predictions of this inflammatory process, which leads to the organ dysfunctions in the SARS-CoV-2 infected patients. So now we know that, this is a more sort of inflammatory the disease. We also have a clarity on anticoagulation and the thrombolytic therapy. So I can tell you that now we are a little more wiser compared to 1 year back. Now coming to the clinical presentation, I think we should learn these clinical presentations carefully, and this will help in management of most of our patients. If I tell you about the clinical presentations of the first the outbreak of COVID infection and comparing it with the current outbreak, I think clinical presentation is more or less same. Like there are few higher the presenting features of diarrhea, but let me tell you that the complications remains the same. So the patients are those who has a hyperinflammatory phase. They are heading towards the respiratory failure. They are heading towards the other organ like liver or the renal failure because of this hyperinflammation. And there are quite a few patients, because of the hyperinflammation, they end up into the meningoencephalitis. So clinical presentation is more or less same with the current outbreak, and the complication rates are more or less same. The only difference that which is prominent in the current outbreak, that is the second or the third wave, I can say this is a third wave, that the young peoples are more involved this time. Maybe they are moving around, they are careless, and the gathering and the partying and other things leads to the more involvement of the young peoples. And the another important features that we have noticed is that entire family is affected. So if the family of 5 or 6, then entire 5 or 6 persons will be infected by COVID-19, which was not there in the first the phase, right? And why this is so, why the young people are infected, why the entire family is infected, we'll see in subsequent discussion. We have also seen a few COVID-19 infections after complete vaccinations, right? So I remember one case who has received, who took a part in the Covaxin study. So he took a first dose in 1st of January 2021, and his second was on 28th January 2021. And before 3 weeks, he came with the COVID infection, and he has the symptoms. But when I looked him into the carefully, like he has only mild symptoms, like he has only the mild elevation of the fever for 2 days. He had mild sore throat and mild body pain. That's it. And because like these symptoms were consistent with COVID, and now we are having a large number of patients, so he tested himself. And when you look at the city value report of this RT-PCR, it was 32. So, it is consistent with the person who are getting infections following vaccination, that they generally tends to have a low viral load, meaning that they have a very high city value. They have milder symptoms like this patient, and he has spontaneous recovery. So we do not have to do anything for them. I just counsel them that you may get a mild infection. And the another important aspect of this COVID infection, which has developed after 2 doses of the vaccine, is that they are less transmissible to the other persons. So their COVID infection, they are not efficiently able to transmit to the close contacts. So these are the advantages of the COVID vaccination, that you can get a mild symptoms. your viral load would be very low. So you have a very high CT value on RT-PCR and the transmission capability is less. But we do have many cases of COVID infections after one dose, and they do have significant symptoms after getting COVID after first dose of vaccine. Now, clinical presentation. I think if we become master of this clinical presentation, then probably we can give better care to our COVID-19 infected patients. The important thing that you have to ask when somebody came to your clinic or when you are visiting a patient in your hospital is that, what is a day of illness? This day of illness is extremely important, right? So you need to tease out that when did you get first symptoms like even headache or some body pain. That could be the day one we have to consider. Even though the patient has started getting a fever, which brings him to the notice and which brings him to a laboratory or to the doctor to test the COVID infection. So what was the first symptom and when it has started? And then you have to start calculating days from that day one where patient has started getting symptoms. Why this is important? There are 2-3 important points that I would like to tell you. One is that the majority of infection transmission or the infections from an infected person occurs one day prior to their symptoms and 3 days after becoming asymptomatic. So almost 4 days time, like patient will be able to transmit his infections to the close contacts. So almost one study says that 70% of the infection will be transmitted by infected patients during this period, that is one day prior to the first symptoms and 3 or at least 4 days after becoming asymptomatic time. So you can screen the contacts during this the time zone where if you want to check for occurrence of COVID infection, then you can select those 4 days where the patient is coming into the contact with other persons. So this is number one important thing. But another important thing that you will be able to know from the day of onset, that you can predict the worsening in that particular patient. And majority of this patient, like when patient develops symptomatic, this is day 0, then patient can get very high grade fever up to 100, 102 for first 2 to 3 days time, right? So during this time period, the patients can get very high fever and all the symptoms related to the replicating virus. And during this 2 to 3 days time, the immune system will start the acting on and it will try to block. And the immune system that I'm referring will be innate immune system. So this non-specific immune system, which is there into the upper and the lower respiratory tract, like macrophage, neutrophils, secretory IgS, all these are very important, the components of innate immune system, which will take care of the replicating virus. So all these patients will become afebrile within 2 to 3 days time, and they becomes asymptomatic, or relatively they will be having a mild symptoms from day 3 to day 7. But with the beginning of the second week, the persons may get new onset of fever, right? And this new onset of fever is probably related to now the patient, the specific immune response, which has now started accumulating or developing in response to the invasion by SARS-CoV-2 virus. So now at the end of first week, the patient's specific immune response will start mounting and patients may enter into the hyperinflammatory phase. So most of these patients will have fever for first few days, becomes all right for next 3 to 4 days time. And once the patient enters into the second week, with the beginning of second week, the patients can have sudden worsening. So patient may feel that, I mean, yesterday I was all right, but now I'm getting very high grade fever and little breathless, and which progresses over next 24 to 48 hours. So within 2 to 3 days time, the patient will be landing into the ICU. So you have to be very specific for this beginning of the second week, where you can target your high risk patient. So we all know like what is a high risk patient: obesity, the other comorbidities like diabetes, hypertension. So all these are the high risk group, right? So you will be very careful, even though like your high risk patient is doing very well in the first week time, but with the beginning of second week, like you may ask them to be very closeful for their sudden worsening of the symptoms for 2 to 3 days time in the beginning of the second week. So this is the importance of this, the knowing the duration of the patient's illness. And we generally note down, like when patient comes to us, like we note down that this is day 5 of his illness. Even on the indoor chart also, we also mention their day 6, day 7, day 8, whatever the day they have. So we generally try to, I mean, pick up them early for the sudden worsening or the occurrence of cytokine storm or the hyperinflammatory phase, which is generally a period of 7, 8, 9 days, right? So this is very important. And if you act quickly here by proper anti-inflammatory agents, then probably you may cut short the duration of the symptomatic phase and cut short the duration of the expected complications. So this is very important, that you need to find out and you need to note down the exact timing of the patient's the illness. Now, what are the important predictors of poor prognosis? We all know that the male gender, age, elderly the patient, then they are high risk patients, the smoking, hypertension, diabetes, ischemic heart disease, and few important laboratory features that we are going to ask them on the day of presentation. That is uh, complete blood count, C-reactive protein, D-dimer, and for tropi and myoglobin for very high risk patients, not for all patients. So CBC, CRP, D-dimer, and the blood sugar and the liver and the kidney function test, these are the minimum recommended tests on presenting illness. So if somebody is having a very high neutrophil lymphocyte ratio, or the very high CRP or the high D-dimer on presentation, so whatever presentation that patient, either on day 2 or day 4 or whatever, then you should be very careful that these are the marker of poor prognosis. We will see that. Now, why male gender, age, smoking, or obesity, diabetes falls into the poor prognostic markers? The explanation for this, the poor prognostic, the markers is that all these things like male gender, smoking, diabetes, hypertension, it leads to the endothelial dysfunctions. So these are the risk factors for the endothelial dysfunctions. And when somebody is having a pre-existing endothelial dysfunction, the SARS-CoV-2 virus primarily infect the endothelial cells, the vascular endothelial cells, because it is rich in the S2 receptors. And when patient is having a serious illness or the severe disease, these patients can have features like systemic vasculitis. And this is just because of the severe generalized endothelitis, right? And because these are the risk factors for pre-existing endothelial dysfunctions, on top of that, when the SARS-CoV-2 occurs, it aggravates the endothelial dysfunctions by producing endothelitis, and the patients can have significant and severe end organ dysfunction, damage, and death, right? We have to remember that, like when we categorize our patients on presentation, that like these are the high risk patients, and we generally discuss with the patient's relative or the patient that, look, you fall into the high risk category, but it doesn't mean that your patient is going to die, right? These are the patients who are likely to get the severe COVID or the COVID complications, right? It doesn't mean that all the patients with the high risk, they are going to die. So we need to explain this in great detail to reduce the anxiety to the patients and patients relative. Let me support the things that I discussed with you just now. This is a very old study, like last year's study from China, which says that like when somebody is having a neutrophil lymphocyte ratio of less than 3.13 and the patient's age is less than 50, right? So this is this orange line. So they have a very good prognosis, and the chances of severe disease would be much less compared to those patients who are elderly patients, so more than 50 years of age, and those patients who has NLR is more than 3.13. So this is a purple line where you can see that chances of COVID complications and the survival probability goes down significantly, right? So higher the age, the poorer the prognosis, and higher the NLR, poorer the prognosis. This is another publications which try to correlate the laboratory findings with the outcome of the patients. And the orange color is the person who died, and the green is the persons who survived and discharged. So the persons who has a very high troponin, cardiac troponin, they have a poor prognosis. Similarly, the patient who are having rhabdomyolysis and the myoglobin they have very poor prognosis. Similarly, the baseline very high C-reactive protein is also associated with the mortality, and the high IL-6, which is again a marker of inflammation. And in this pie chart, as well as in this, the bar chart, like it should try to correlate with the outcome and the age. So again, the similar color code applies here. The orange will be the persons who died and the green will be persons who survived. So you can see that when the bar crosses the age of 51 to 55, the orange proportion is steadily increases. So as the age progresses, the chances of the poor outcome increases. So these are the two supportive evidence. Now coming to the very important, the complication that we are facing in management of moderate to severe COVID patient. And again, I told you that now we know the pathogenesis, and we are, gaining this knowledge because of the very good autopsy studies from the Europe as well as from the United States. And in this autopsy study, like it has shown very clearly that there are two important pathology which has occurred into a patient who has the SARS-CoV-2 infection. One is the diffuse alveolar damage, giving rise to the acute respiratory distress syndrome like pictures because of the inflamed thickened alveoli which impairs the gas exchange. So one is the diffuse alveolar damage with the lymphocytic inflammation or the infiltrations. And the another important thing which is very prominent, though it is seen in the patient who has severe influenza and the other coronaviral infection, and that is the intravascular thrombosis, the small vessel or the small capillaries. So this is the alveolar septa, and you can see that this is the capillary which is entirely thrombus, right? This is also thrombosis into the capillary here also. So this alveolar septa, because of this, the thrombus into the pulmonary capillaries, there is the mismatch into the oxygenation as well as the carbon dioxide exchange, and this can lead to the respiratory failure. So when you look at the CT scan, this is a CT scan of our patient. When you trace the pulmonary arteries, you can see the tip, around the tip of the pulmonary vessels, you will find the big GGO. So probably this also represents the intravascular, the coagulations or the thrombosis in the small pulmonary vessels. So these two pathology, one is diffuse alveolar damage and second is the intravascular thrombosis or the coagulopathy, which leads to the impaired gas exchange and the death of the patients. Now, how do we treat? So in 1 year, we are a little bit confident that we are going to treat our patients like this. Still, we are awaiting a good and potent antiviral that unfortunately, we do not have potent antiviral agents. But broadly, treatment can be divided into two big parts. One is the non-pharmacological interventions, which are extremely important. And the second part is the pharmacological interventions. The non-pharmacological the interventions are extremely important in saving life. And the most important will be oxygen therapy. So once your patient becomes hypoxic, you can give oxygen therapy according to the severity of the hypoxia. So starting from the nasal prongs, mask, then the non-rebreathing mask, BiPAP, HFNC, or then invasive ventilation. So oxygen therapy would be very important, the component of non-pharmacological therapy. The another important component would be the awake proning. So even though patient is hypoxic and patient is maintaining on 6 liter or whatever the oxygen that patient is requiring, if you ask your patient to do awake proning, that will improve the oxygenation, it will reduce the need of oxygen therapy, and there will be a rapid improvement of the lung opacities and oxygenation. So if patient is obese patient with the bulky belly, you may, rather than going for a proning where it is very difficult for them, you can go for a semi-prone position on the right side as well as on the left side. So this non-pharmacological therapy probably help large number of patients, and they will prevent their upscaling to the ICU therapy, right? So I think this is a very important, doable thing, very small thing, and it is not expensive also. Just we need to spend some time with your patient, just explain them that this is going to be very helpful. And most of these patients, they try to follow religiously. So awake proning is very important component. And then prone ventilation. So when patient requires BiPAP or invasive ventilations like this, our patient, proning will help a lot to most of the patients. So we should not forget the value of these simple things. Now coming to the pharmacological intervention in this COVID-19, we have to understand that this COVID-19 is not a pure infectious disease, right? So when I talk about the influenza, When I talk about the dengue infection or when I talk about the other respiratory viral infections, then probably I'm talking about an infectious disease that produces a disease in our patients. But let me tell you that COVID-19 is more than infectious disease. The infectious component or the infectious disease component of COVID-19 is very small compared to the inflammatory component, right? So most of the patient with moderate to severe disease that we are treating, they have inflammatory component, and we are treating inflammatory component of this viral infections rather than actual infectious disease produced by the virus, because we don't have antiviral drugs, right? So currently, as of now, like when we do not have antivirals, the antiviral therapy, whatever is available, like we do have like oral antiviral agents as well as the intravenous antiviral agents available for treatment, which blocks the RNA-dependent RNA polymerase. But this, both the antiviral agents, they have the very weak antiviral activity against this virus. So it plays a very little role in the treatment of the COVID-19 infections. The most important things when you are discussing a pharmacological interventions in COVID-19 patients, the timing is extremely important, right? So when you are doing a timely pharmacological intervention, it's going to help your patient. And here comes the day, right? So initially, like I, I told you about, we should be very clear about what is a day of patient's symptoms onsets and which day we are now treating these patients, right? It's a day 6 or day 8 or day 9, whatever it may be. So this timing is extremely important. And if you are doing a timely pharmacological intervention, then that can save life of that patient, and that will reduces the chances of progressions to a severe disease. So I think we should spend little more time to find out which day of illness the patient is having. Now, what are those pharmacological interventions? One is anticoagulation. So I'm not going to discuss in detail about the anticoagulation. The anti-inflammatory, I'm going to take more time to discuss the anti-inflammatory agents in the treatment of this COVID-19. That is steroids, tocilizumab, anakinra. Anakinra is not available, that is IL-1 inhibitor, and baricitinib. The antiviral agents, I'm not going to discuss in detail because we do not have potent antiviral agents, and the role of antiviral agent is very limited in the treatment of the COVID infection. The reason is that none of the antiviral, the two which is available in India, is having a mortality benefit, and it is not having any clinically significant effect on the viral replication. In the sense that if you are treating your SARS-CoV-2 patient who has a fever and coming to your clinic in early period, that is on day 3, day 4, when you are prescribing antiviral, we expect the block in the replications, which is translated into the recovery of the symptoms. The way we expect the response of oseltamivir in influenza, right? So we have a timetable of recovery of influenza patient once we prescribe them oseltamivir. Within a 48 hours time, more than 90% of your patient with influenza will have significant symptomatic improvement in terms of reductions in the headache, improvement in the fever, or patient may become totally afebrile, and the improvement in body pain, right? So this is a 48 hours time period is because oseltamivir will block the replicating influenza virus, and which will be translated into the clinical response. You will not find similar clinical response to either favipiravir or the remdesivir. It has no significant effect. So, I mean, we are not going to discuss detail about the antiviral therapy. Convalescent plasma, still we can use convalescent plasma, though there are multiple negative studies, but you can use very high antibody titer convalescent plasma to a high risk patient. Those who has a very high risk of disease progressions, or patient who has profound immunodeficiency, either combined variable immunoglobulin deficiency or patient has acquired immunoglobulin deficiency, whatever like immunoglobulin deficiency patient is having. Here you can think of high antibody titer convalescent plasma. So I think today we have only one or very few indications where I can go for convalescent plasma therapy in COVID patients. Similarly, IVIG or the hyperimmune serum, unfortunately, we do not have hyperimmune serum to treatment of COVID infection, but similar to like HBIG or RBIG, that is rabies immunoglobulin, or the hepatitis B immunoglobulin, the we can have the SARS-CoV hyperimmune serum, which can be used for the treatment of a patient who has a risk of disease progressions. And the monoclonal antibodies in United States, like combination monoclonal antibodies are now approved for the treatment of COVID infection. So I'm going to touch upon this part also. Now coming to the anti-inflammatory agents, because I mean, these are the drugs which actually saves the life. So we do not have any evidence with the use of antiviral and reductions in the mortality. The benefit of remdesivir in most of the studies is reductions in the hospitalization. But when you look at the patient's outcome, the survival, there is no change between the remdesivir, that is intervention arm, and the control arm. So remdesivir also has no effect on the survival, or there is no survival benefit. The only survival benefit that you can expect is from the anti-inflammatory agents, and one is dexamethasone. So we all know about this recovery study, so I'm not going to discuss in detail about the recovery study, but the important message that we should get from this dexamethasone study is that in this study, they have clearly mentioned that there is no benefit amongst those patients who did not require oxygen therapy or the respiratory support, right? So the message is very clear and loud that if your patient is not hypoxic, if you are prescribing dexamethasone, it's not going to give any benefit to your patients compared to those patients who requires respiratory support in terms of oxygen therapy, right? So we have to understand that dexamethasone or the steroids are only for those patients who are hypoxic. If we are using dexamethasone for all COVID-19 patients, the patients may not have any benefit, number one. And if we are using COVID steroids in the COVID patients during the first week, where I'm talking about that our innate immune system is taking an important role in containing a virus, that is our neutrophils, macrophages, secretory IgA. And if I'm prescribing dexamethasone or the steroids during this time, it immediately hampers the functions of innate immune system. It will lead to the qualitative dysfunctions of macrophages, qualitative dysfunctions of neutrophil, and it will not able to block the replicating virus, and it will allow virus to have more intense replications and prolonged replications into the upper and the lower respiratory tract. And in fact, you are producing harm to COVID-19 patients by prescribing corticosteroids, right? So do not prescribe steroids to a patient who are in the first week and patients who are not hypoxic, right? So this message is very clear from this recovery study. Another important anti-inflammatory agent is tocilizumab. So we know that in last year, like there are several publications on tocilizumab showing some benefit. Most of these initial publications, they were not showing any benefit compared to the comparator arm, and there was no mortality benefit, right? But the latest study which prove that tocilizumab plus dexamethasone has a significant survival benefit again to a patient who has entered into the ICU. So within 24 hours of the admission to the ICU, if you are giving them tocilizumab plus dexamethasone, or a patient who requires invasive or non-invasive mechanical ventilator or HFNC. So again, these three patients requires respiratory support. These three group of the patient requires oxygen therapy. So the indication becomes very simple that when you need oxygen therapy, you have to remember anti-inflammatory agents, right? If your patient do not require oxygen therapy, please do not give them steroid. It is harmful. It will give you harm, right? So these are the very important and clear-cut indications of anti-inflammatory. Admission to the ICU within 24 hours, giving steroids or the toci late in a patient who has entered into the ICU will leads to the significant infectious complications like nosocomial infections, the fungal infections, especially the aspergillosis or the mucormycosis. So we have to give, when you are planning this anti-inflammatory, within 24 hours of entering ICU, you have to give these important agents. The another important indications for TOSI plus steroid or the TOSI alone or the steroid alone would be the patient is hospitalized with the COVID-19 and patient is having a rapidly worsening oxygen requirement, right? So rapid progressions. here you have to act very fast. So rather than relying on dexamethasone, here I would definitely prefer tocilizumab plus dexamethasone. Now we have one more options here. In a patient who has hypoxia and admitted to the ICU with bilateral pneumonia requiring remdesivir therapy, or the remdesivir is indicated, you can use remdesivir plus baricitinib as an anti-inflammatory agent. The advantage of baricitinib over dexamethasone is that dexamethasone can lead to the hyperglycemia in diabetic patients, as well as it may precipitate hyperglycemia in a non-diabetic patients. So in a situation where the dexamethasone is relatively contraindicated or giving you a trouble in terms of the glycemic control, baricitinib is a very good option, and it gives excellent results equivalent to the dexamethasone. And the advantage is that it is oral therapy, 4 milligram, one tablet once a day for 7 to 14 days is the minimum requirement. And it is a quick in action, right? So even though you are giving it orally, it is a very rapid onset of action. So current IDSA guideline, apart from the NIH guideline, they also recommend tocilizumab in the patient who has the hyperinflammation. The monoclonal antibodies in United States, like they have several monoclonal antibodies, and when you look at the spelling of these monoclonal antibodies, sometimes it is very difficult to spell, very difficult to pronounce also, right? But the indications of these monoclonal antibodies is outpatients, right? So it is not for inpatient therapy. And the important indications for the monoclonal antibody therapy is that those high-risk patients where you suspect that there is a very high risk for progressions to the severe disease. Again, so now we have to look at the markers of poor prognosis, high NLR, high CRP, multiple comorbidities, elderly patients. So these are the patients where you expect the disease progression. So you have to give this combination monoclonal antibody early, because you have to block this virus early during first few days of symptom onset, right? So if you are giving this monoclonal antibody after day 7, is not going to play any role, because within the first week time, the innate immune system of the patients might have taken care of this virus. Virus has challenged the immune system. Virus has started mounting immune response because of the ongoing replications during first week. And this monoclonal antibody is not going to add anything to your patients. So if at all you want to use these monoclonal antibodies, it should be used early to an outpatient where you expect that these patients are going to have severe disease, right? And the BLAZE study was presented into the CROI. The CROI is the HIV conference this year, where they have presented many COVID papers also. In BLAZE, BLAZE 1 study was also presented into the CROI. So they compare this monoclonal antibody versus placebo, 1,000 patients. So it's a good number of patients. And they've given this to the patient who has a mild to moderate COVID. And they found that there is a 70% reductions in the hospitalization or death by day 29 to a patient who received monoclonal antibodies. So these are very good agents. It is exactly like the hyperimmune serum or the patient who has a very high IgG containing the convalescent plasma. So this drug has the similar mechanism of action. So just to summarize this pharmacological intervention, we have the 4 for remdesivir for moderate to severe disease, dexamethasone for hypoxic patient, toci for rapidly progressive patient who has hyperinflammation or the cytokine storm. Baricitinib is good agents for steroids are contraindicated or when you want to spare steroids for some other reasons. And monoclonal antibodies is for outpatients, not for the inpatients. And we have strong recommendation against the use of hydroxychloroquine, ivermectin, azithromycin, and doxycycline. So I think we should not discuss all these agents where they have no effect, and one should avoid the use of these 4 agents. So message to our practicing doctors group is that don't use steroids to all patients because it is a poison. So I think, this is a most appropriate description for steroid, that it is a poison for all the patients, except for those patients who are hypoxic patients. Do not prescribe antibiotics or antiparasitic agents to COVID-19 patient because this is a viral infection and antibiotic is not going to work or antiparasitic is not going to work, even though there are in vitro data, but in vivo, because to achieve that particular concentration into the lining respiratory epithelial cells by this ivermectin or other drugs is very high. So you cannot dose into that particular the dosage to that patients to achieve the neutralizing levels into the lining epithelium. But we have to do a minimum pharmacological interventions to a stable patients. We need to monitor high risk patients very closely, especially when they are entering into the day 8 of illness, and we have to act early. So if they are heading towards the hyperinflammation or new onset high grade fever, then we need to act early and we have to provide appropriate anti-inflammatory agents. So what I mean by the minimum pharmacological intervention, we have to understand that 80% of the patients, they are going to recover without any support. Only 15 to 20% of the patients, they requires hospitalization therapy for their moderate COVID illness, and 4 to 5% of the patients, they head into the ICU. So 80% of the patients, like if you ask them to have rest, adequate hydration, and just paracetamol, they are going to respond to these three therapies, right? So there is no need to prescribe anything to these 80% of the patients. Only thing is that when you are looking at a high risk patient with high risk laboratory abnormalities or the high risk, the patient's characteristics, then you prescribe all these things, three things, that is rest, hydration, and paracetamol. But you are closely monitoring these patients for disease progressions, and you are going to do early appropriate intervention. Say, for example, patient is stable and now patient has developed hypoxia on day 8 of the illness, patient is high risk patient, then you have to admit, you have to give remdesivir, because remdesivir is indicated when somebody is having a bilateral pulmonary opasities and hypoxia. So you have to give remdesivir, you have to give either anti-inflammatory, either baricitinib or dexamethasone. And if your patient is heading towards hyperinflammation, or what we call as a cytokine storm, I think I'll upfront give them tocilizumab to halt the disease progression, because COVID is an inflammatory disease rather than infectious disease. Now coming to the very important current topic, and that is variants. Now, when do we suspect the COVID variants? Because I talked about like the important clinical presentations, important laboratory parameters, and the interventions, pharmacological as well as the non-pharmacological. But we know that like India, we have all three variants are circulating into the community in most of the states, even though like we know that there are 7 or 8 states has been declared that variants are present. But I believe that all the states, they are having a good number of variants in their infected population. So when do we suspect? The most important thing is that when we have history of travel to the countries, this is number one. But probably like the way the disease has progressed, the travel history is playing a less important role in suspecting variant infection. The another important is contact with the confirmed case of COVID variant. Still, this statement holds true. So if you have diagnosed COVID variant infection in some patients and now somebody has come into the contact and he found positive, then you should suspect that he is also infected with the COVID variant. The third is that entire family is infected with COVID-19 infection. So this is what I told you in the introduction slide, that in this outbreak, it is common to see that entire family is being infected. So when you have entire family infected, think for variants. The reason is that the variants have high transmission capability. So the entire family gets infected with the COVID-19 infection. So when you are handling the entire family, then think for the variant infection. The patient who has COVID in the first outbreak, so last June, July, or August, patient has COVID infections, and now patient is getting new COVID infection. Think for the variant, right? Because there are few variants, they can evade the immune system of the patient who has a prior COVID infections, and that can produces the symptomatic reinfection or the symptomatic new infection. The patient developing infections after vaccination, again, I told you that the one variant is capable of evading the immune system. So either by the natural infection or by the vaccination. By evading, it can be able to produce a symptomatic disease. So when somebody came to you with history of vaccinations and now becoming a COVID positive, think for variant. But two important other clues would be when you have a rapid antigen negative in a patient with the clinical syndrome which is consistent with COVID-19, and now RT-PCR comes positive for these patients. Even though the sensitivity for rapid antigen is just 50% and RT-PCR is 66 to 70%. Even though there is the big gap, but it is very important to suspect when the antigen is negative and the PCR is positive that this is very likely that this is the variant infection. The reason is that the variant has S gene dropout. So if you read the RT-PCR report carefully, you will find that the ORF is positive, the N gene is positive, but S gene is negative. So when you are looking at S gene dropout, it is a variant infection, right? And the rapid antigen detects the gene. And that's the reason that with a variant infection, you will find a rapid antigen negative, but the RT-PCR comes positive with S gene dropout. So this is where you have to suspect the COVID variant. Now, few definitions, because we are using these terms very commonly, mutations, variant, and the strain. So what I mean by mutation, or what I mean by the variant or the strain, mutations are generally referred to the change in the amino acid sequence. So for example, in 614 position, if the aspartic acid is replaced by the glycine at 614 position, then it is called as D, that is aspartic acid, which is replaced at 614 position by the glycine. So this is called as D614G. Similar to the HIV, like in HIV also we just generally describe mutations in the similar fashion, like M184V mutation for lamivudine. So similarly, like this position, which is a very important, the spike glycoprotein, that is 614 position, where the aspartate replaced or the substituted by glycine produces significant change in the virus genome, and this is called as mutation. The variant is the same thing when you are subjecting the virus for the whole genome sequencing, and when you find the sequences are different from each other, which is called as the variants. So, but this is not very the precise definition, because when we talk about the variants, it could be because of the one mutation, that is either D614 or the similar, or there will be many mutations which is producing the difference in the whole genome sequencing, right? So variant could be because of the mutations, or it could be because of multiple mutations and giving rise to a variants. And the strain is again a phenotype of the variants, where this, because of this variant, now the person has a different antigenicity, person has different transmission capability, or the virus is having different virulence in that particular host. So now this variant is called as a strain. So this is a UK strain or the Brazilian strain, where you have a different in the antigen characteristics, you have a difference in the transmission capability, and the difference in the virulence, right? So these are the three terms: mutation, variants, and the strain. Now, why this the mutation is very important? Because when you know, when you look at the epidemiology in the Europe, in January 11 last year, when the outbreak has started spreading across the Europe, then predominant virus of the SARS-CoV-2 was the D614, that is original, or the wild type virus, that is D614. But from the mid-February last year, the D614 started mutating into the 614G. So this blue color is the mutated virus, and which has started from the mid-February, and within a 1.5 to 2 months time, almost all the virus which is spreading across the Europe has mutated from D614 to the G614, right? So this is why, this is how the mutated virus has spread very rapidly across the Europe, and why it has become a predominant component in the European countries. The reason is that the wild type virus, that is D614 virus, has the less replication capability compared to the G614 virus, which has very high replication capability. And that's the reason that the entire family gets infected, because of very high viral replication, very high viral shedding, and very high capacity to transmit their viral infections to the contacts, right? So this is how, like, this D, that is wild type virus, becomes the mutated G virus into the European countries. This is again very important experiments which was published into the NEJM on the same D to G614 virus mutation. So what they did, they did the culture studies into the human lung epithelial cell lines, and they found that the G virus has a very high replication potential and very high replication capacity. So the efficiency of replication is much high, even in the viral cell culture line compared to the wild type, that is D virus. Similarly, like they have also studied into the human airway lining tissue model, and they found the similar results, that the G virus more efficiently replicated into the human epithelial respiratory airways. Even in hamster model, they replicated the same thing, and they tried to neutralize by the antibodies. So they took us antibodies from a patient who has actually experienced the COVID infection. They collected neutralizing antibodies and given a serum treatment. And these neutralizing antibodies were capable of blocking G as well as the D virus. So there is no viral replications when you use this serum containing antibodies to these viral cultures, right? So this is the antibodies were capable of blocking G as well as the D. There is no sunlight. And when there is no antibodies, the virus is freely replicated. So this is a good news for the D to G mutations. Now, what are the clinical implications? Like why we are talking so much about the G mutations into the 614 position in the spike glycoprotein? This the G mutation has replaced the D across the Europe, and probably now it becomes a dominant pandemic form. Even in India also, if we study that, probably we are also dealing with the G614 mutations because of very high replication and high transmission. It rapidly takes over the old wild type, that is D614 virus. There is a consistent increase in the G614 regional levels. This may indicate that there is more fitness and there is a fitness advantage. So this virus is going to survive into the environment, into the country for a longer time because of this fitness advantage by this G mutation. And when you look at this, the RT-PCR CT values in a patient who has G mutated virus, you will find that this patient is having a very high viral load. And most of these patients that we have seen at Ahmedabad, their CT value is always less than 14. So it represents very high replicating virus into these patients. And again, like this is a similar patient that they shed more virus because they have very high viral load, their CT value is very low. So they are going to shed this virus more efficiently and in more amount into the surrounding environment to infect higher number of the contacts compared to the wild type, that is D counterpart, right? So this is a very important clinical relevance of mutation. Now, what about the clinical outcome? Does it make any difference? Initially, we believe that, I mean, it is having a very high infectiousness, but clinically it produces the milder symptoms, but it is not true. This is an important study published in this month from UK, and this is a match cohort study. And important part of this match cohort study is that it involves 54,000, 55,000, not 54,000, 55,000 match pair participants who tested positive for these COVID infections between October to January 2021, right? So large number of patients has been enrolled in this and analyzed. And the primary outcome of this study was death within 28 days of first positive RT-PCR results. So this was their primary outcome. And what they found that the S gene negative means there is a deletion of S gene, and this is a variant. So this is what we are talking about, that this is a G variant, 614G. And the S gene positive is the original wild type, that is D614. And the out of these 55,000, what they found that the people, those who were infected by the UK variant of this 614G, 64% more chances that they are likely to die compared to the D variant virus. So it produces the death in higher proportion of the patients compared to the original wild type of virus, right? Even though when you look at the total number of deaths out of this, it is less, but when you compare the wild type of SARS-CoV, that is D SARS-CoV, to the G mutated SARS-CoV, the death is 64% more likely, right? So this is very significant. So we need to be very careful, and we should not take this mutated virus very lightly that it is going to produce a milder illness. It is not true. The another important variants that we are dealing in India also, that is a South African variants, and it was detected in late 2020 in the Brazil, in the South Africa. And again, similar to the UK variant, it also spreads very rapidly. It has also very high viral load and very high viral shedding. But the important difference from the UK variant is that it eludes the previous immune response. So this is very bad about these South African variants, that the person who has past COVID infections or the person who has received vaccine, very likely that the immune response that we have mounted against this previous SARS-CoV-2 may not be effective and may not be neutralizing these virus, right? So even the convalescent plasma with neutralizing antibody may not be able to neutralize these variants in infected patients. So this is the important difference about the South African variants. And there is one good news about the South African variant is that both Pfizer and the Moderna, they claim that they found that they did a good study that probably the antibody response that both the vaccines generates, they maintain the receptor binding domain for these South African variants, and which can neutralize the virus, or it can produces the less severe, less significant the clinical disease. So Brazilian variants more contagious. Virus has additional change to the N-terminal domain, so which produces the less responsive to the antibodies or the eluding the neutralizing antibody response, and the patients can have the progressive disease because of the Brazilian variants. Still, we do not have the clinical outcome data similar to the UK variants data from the Brazil, but we expect that probably it is also producing the significant severe side effects or the complications. Now coming to the post-COVID medical issues, important post-COVID medical issues, I'll go very briefly because it is more than an hour. Now we know that like large number of our COVID infected patients, they continue to suffer even after discharge from the hospital. And many of these patients, they requires readmission to the non-COVID hospital because of their lingering COVID illness, which could be a pulmonary or which could be the non-pulmonary or the extra pulmonary component, as well as some psychosomatic or the emotional issues also. The one study says that like in this study, like they have enrolled 384 patients. The mean age was 60 years. And what they found that they followed these patients for almost 2 months, that is 54 days after hospital discharge. They found that almost half of the patients out of 384, they reported persistent breathlessness. 1/3 of the patients, they reported cough, and 2/3 of the patients, they continue to report fatigue even after discharge from the hospital. And 15% of the patients, they had depression. But those patients who has very high or the severe illness, their component is very high compared to those patients who has milder illness. And those patients who has elevated biomarkers at the time of discharge, like elevated CRP or the elevated D dimer, I mean, they continue to have a more symptomatic disease, and almost 40% of the patients, they continue to have abnormal chest radiograph, and 9% they also reported deteriorations in the radiographs. When you look at the symptoms after discharge from the COVID, so this is the dark bars are the COVID symptoms, and the light colors are the post-COVID symptoms. You can see that fatigue, dyspnea, arthralgia, chest discomfort, coughing, all these are continue to have in a patient who are recovering from the COVID, or the patient gets discharged from the COVID. And this probably continues to be a major problem even when we have less acute COVID patients. Again, the same thing I told you, that those initially sick patients, they have higher percentage of the patient, those who has persistent prolonged symptoms compared to those patients who has milder or the relatively asymptomatic the COVID actual COVID infection. Just to summarize this, the long talk, the 80% of the COVID infected patients, they are going to recover without hospitalization and without pharmacological intervention. So this is extremely important to our practicing doctors group, that we should not do unnecessary interventions to all these patients. Even in my clinical practice, I just prescribe them rest, hydration, and paracetamol. That's it. and we'll ask them to monitor clinically, saturations, fever, and the laboratory parameters if they falls into the high risk category periodically depending on their baseline reports. But even if baseline reports are normal, I do insist them to get the repeat inflammatory marker CBC on the day 8 of their illness, right? So this is how like I monitor my patients, and we generally do not prescribe anything to most of these patients. So these three are very important: hydration, rest, and paracetamol. Steroid, we have to understand that it is a poison. We should not prescribe to all diagnosed patients. They are indicated only in hypoxic patients. Remdesivir is not a magic drug, but still it is useful in patients with moderate to severe pneumonias because it can definitely reduces the duration of hospitalization. This is the only evidence that we have. It has no benefit in the outcome of mortality. Tocilizumab with or without steroid is extremely helpful in a patient who has rapidly progressive hypoxia or the cytokine storm. So COVID-19 is more inflammatory rather than infective illness. So I think rheumatologists and the immunologist colleagues should have helped treating doctors more compared to the infectious disease doctor. The anti-inflammatory plays a major role compared to the antivirals, and it is a life-saving compared to the antivirals in the treatment of patient with moderate to severe COVID illness. The current mutation, the UK strain or the South African or the Brazilian strain, have predominant component of the D614G mutation, which leads to the increased viral fitness, leads to the increased viral replication potential. And because of the increased replication, it has more transmission capability. And you will see a large number of patients being infected by this strain. The outcome data from the UK showed higher mortality with D614G mutation. So this is not a good news for us. And the long COVID or the post-COVID symptoms are very common, and it is related to the initial severity of illness. So those patients who has a very severe illness, they are going to suffer a prolonged and the significant symptomatic post-COVID or the long COVID symptoms. Thank you very much for the patients listening. I'm ready to answer your queries and questions.
Thank you, Dr. Patel, for I think you have covered each and everything about COVID, what was there in 2020 and what would be there in 2021. So welcome, Dr. Arjun Khanna. Arjun Khanna has joined, and I hope that everything is okay at your end.
All good.
So first of all, I would like to take your comment, Dr. Arjun, regarding his talk and how would you say COVID-19 in 2021? Just your comments.
Sure, I must congratulate the speaker for summarizing it so well. It was a job very well done, and sir has already put light on most of the points. It's back, and it's back with a bang, and it's hit us harder than ever before. And some of the things that sir has already said, clustering of families and people who've already had it once getting it twice, and this is what makes us so scared and looking for the new strains. I think a few changes that we are seeing this time, what I would say it is behaving differently from the last time is these are just very early initial observations that we have seen as of now. We have close to around 100 patients admitted, not 100, but yeah, close to 100 admitted with us right now. So I think this time even the younger population is not spared. I have one first year MBBS student who's presented with ARDS in the ICU right now. We did not have this in the last year. So this year, the average, if you take out the cut section, the median age of the patients who are in our ICU, I think it's significantly lower. It would be somewhere around between 45 to 55. I think last season it was between 65 to 75. So younger patients are involved more, I think, this time. And this time, what we are seeing is, we had the classical CT presentation of COVID, where, we could identify it at 2 a.m. in the night that this could be nothing but COVID. But this time we've had more diffuse disease also, something behaving more like an ARDS kind of a picture, where you actually would not really look for COVID. You would, put them like influenza or something of that kind of a picture on CT scan. Even that has turned out to be COVID positive. This time patients are becoming negative more rapidly. So last time there was this issue, patients were not getting rapidly, patients were not getting negative and all. There were patients who would be positive with their RT-PCRs for weeks together. This time, I think patients are getting negative very rapidly. And it has got nothing to do with the clinical severity of the disease. In fact, patients with very severe disease are turning out to be negative. I think this has got something to do with the change of the strain that probably our kids are not picking up. On the other hand, you have the classical CTs where it could not be anything but COVID, but the RT-PCR is coming out to be negative. Now, this was there last year also, but I think the prevalence of that has increased this year. When it comes to pharmacotherapy, what new are we doing? We have started using baricitinib in our practice. As sir said, it is a steroid-sparing anti-inflammatory agent. We are using it more in high-risk patients who have come with severe disease. It has to be given the trial, the NEGM trial is only when it was used in conjugation with remdesivir. So any patient where we are starting remdesivir and patient who is a sick patient, high oxygen requirement, you need to look for, there's a ratio of lymphocyte neutrophil ratio. You really need to look into that. And baricitinib, it's 4 milligrams OD. We have started using that this year. I think we've used it in 20-30 odd patients as of now. I really don't have the data to support or to, disregard it right now. Probably in the months to come, we'll become wiser with this drug. This year, we are not really using too much of tocilizumab. We know it's a fantastic drug when used in the right patient. But I think this time, अभी last season के जो tocilizumab दिए थे, उनके side effects के साथ अभी, we are dealing with a lot of them. Reactivation of COX, mucor, aspergillus, definitely more in patients who were given tocilizumab. Not very high, but yes, definitely more. One of a fellow pulmonologists lost his father after they were giving he was given tocilizumab because he had come in cytokine storm, developed a combination of TB plus mucor post toci. So this year I think little softer we are while using toci, and because we are moving away from IL-6 per se, and because IL-6 values again are rapidly declining. When you check, on day one, say the IL-6 value is 200. If you check it the next day, somehow IL-6 values, as giving them anti-inflammatory agents, they're going down quite rapidly. So we are not really targeting IL-6 this year with tocilizumab. And I just these are the few observations that we have made. We are only around 1 month, 3 to 4 weeks old into it. So I think by next 4-5 weeks we would be wiser.
Yeah, thank you, Dr. Arjun, for your comments. Actually, the Indian government, Indian scientists actually are, suspecting a peak around, the second or third week of April. And after that, maybe after say 2 to 3 months, we would get to know the actual picture at what actually we are heading towards. Now, I would like to take a comment from Dr. Vijay Arora sir, our president also, and he is heading the Department of Internal Medicine at Max Pantograph. Sir, what is your observation in this new surge of COVID-19, sir? Sir, unmute yourself, sir.
Thank you, Pankaj. And thank you, Dr. Atul Patel, for a very nice presentation. Non-stop, without a glass of water, 1.5 hours, you are continuously speaking. You have a definite stamina like our Prime Minister. I think all Gujaratis have the stamina to work like this. And thank you very much. And yes, we are facing a lot of problem this time. And as Arjun dear has said that the younger population is affecting much. Apart from the younger population, we are finding the people are having COVID-like illness, but most of them are RT-PCR negative. We had at present 2 patients admitted with us. The typical picture of COVID, CT was having severity score of 12/25, but repeated RT-PCR was negative. And then we didn't accept this defeat, and we went 4th time also, and that time it was positive. CBNAT was positive. So what should we do in such patient? Because unless the RT-PCR or CBNAT is positive, these are the people. Should we start with remdesivir in such patients just on the basis of CT finding, or should we start this convalescent plasma therapy in the early phase? Because we have found the role of convalescent plasma in the early phase very, very effective. Most of our patients who have been admitted in ICU has been benefited with convalescent plasma therapy. And yes, in such patients who are having moderate increase in the transaminases and RT-PCR negative, what is the role of and remdesivir in such patient? And secondly, Dr. Arjun has said that role of Olument 4 milligram daily, but how safe and how logical it is to start along with remdesivir, because the onset of action of Olument is 2 to 4 weeks. The onset of action is 2 to 4 weeks. So how we get this? Don't you think that it is all the viral syndrome which goes off its own without the role of remdesivir or Olument or any other drugs? Because 80% of the people, they are asymptomatic and they are self-limiting disease. So should we really start with Olumet 4 milligram? Because once you find the onset of action is 2 to 4 weeks, so how we can correlate that when we are adding Olumet with remdesivir, the effect will be very fast?
Can I comment?
Yes, yes, sir.
Yeah. So baricitinib, like the onset of action is very quick, very rapid. So even though you are administering it on oral therapy, within 48 hours, like you will start getting effect of baricitinib. So I think, we are not worried about, and the duration of therapy is just maximum 2 weeks time. So it is very rapidly acting, and you can have a full control on the immunosuppressive therapy that you are giving to your patient, right? So I think, and baricitinib, like even though like we have also very small experience, but I found that, the baricitinib is also equally giving a very quick and the dependable response or the results compared to the dexamethasone. And the tocilizumab, like it is a wonder drug. So when the patient is entering into the hyperinflammation day 8, day 9 and running very high grade fever, CRP, which was previously 2 times upper limit of normal, now jumps to the 10 times upper limit of normal. So this is a classical scenario where the patient is starting cytokine storms and patient is started getting hypoxia. So if you are applying tocilizumab at this juncture, so this timing is very important, then your patient has significant improvement and rapid recovery. This patient will not head towards the ICU, or the patient will not require the very invasive or the extended the oxygen therapy, right? So timing is very important, but the value of baricitinib, what I understand or what I feel from the clinical studies and whatever the small experience that we have, I think probably it is capable of replacing dexamethasone in a patient where the glycemic control is going to be a big challenge. Because in the first outbreak, we have many patients where the glycemic control was a big challenge and patients are keeping 350, 400, despite like giving continuous insulin, the infusions and all the care to take care of the sugar control. So, I mean, this is a situation and it is a rapid acting drug. So I think it is an advantage. And for remdesivir, I think without confirming diagnosis, I think we should avoid remdesivir because this is not a magic drug. This is what we need to understand, that it is not a magic drug. But the whatever 2-3 studies which says that remdesivir definitely reduces the duration of hospitalization. So that is the only advantage, right? So for that reductions in the hospital, the days, we are using remdesivir right now, not for an antiviral the potency, because none of the study of using remdesivir is associated with the survival benefit. So if you go through all the remdesivir study, none of the study will tell you that, yes, it is associated with the survival, just like dexamethasone, just like tocilizumab plus dexamethasone, right?
Thank you, Dr. Patel, for your comments. Arjun, your comments, and then we'll take comments from Dr. S. Gupta.
So I agree with sir that baricitinib is actually a rapidly acting drug, and but I think it is. We've not really used it as a steroid-sparing agent. We are using it as an anti-inflammatory, as an add-on therapy to steroids. And this year, because we were skeptical about using tocilizumab, although last year I think I echo absolutely with what Dr. Patel has to say. I think it's a fantastic drug, Toci, when used in the right patient. There was a lot of bad press about tocilizumab, and I think a lot of it was unnecessary, especially the Roche trial, where the inclusion criteria was not that great. But at times, I think it was a wonderful drug if used in the correct patient. And I think the same would be with baricitinib. So all the hoopla regarding COVID is basically, it's all around anti-inflammatory agents. You know, there are patients, I have seen prescriptions from Mumbai where people are big fans of colchicine. And and a lot of patients who have relatives in Mumbai would come to us and would tell us कि वहाँ पे doctor ने colchicine शुरू करने को है. We practically have zero experience with it. I have not used it even in one patient, so I don't know what to do with it. So I think the crux of the matter is anti-inflammatory agents are here to stay. And I think because, as sir has very rightly said, it is a disease which is although an infection, but mostly to do with, the treatment is all anti-inflammatory. So I think over a period of time, I think we would have something even better than baricitinib, or things would keep evolving. But as of now, whatever little we have used in 20-30 patients, I think it tends to make some difference. I've not really seen any side effects with it. It's an oral medication. Let's hope that we'll be wiser in the times to come.
Right. Okay, Dr. Gupta sir, Dr. Satish Gupta sir, your comment, then we'll take some questions from the audience.
Thank you, Pankaj. It had been a wonderful talk, and as Dr. Ruby had said, that Dr. Patel is a wonderful speaker. It was spellbounding, I believe, and he had tried to answer almost all the questions. But I think our viewers have some questions about the vaccines, and a lot of
Right.
questions are waited in the chat box. So I think it is the time to go for the
Right.
vaccine-related questions.
Right. Okay. So, Dr. Patel, we have few questions for you, and then we'll have some questions left from the audience. So, one question is: should a person with a definite history of allergy to penicillin and sulfonamides take the COVID vaccine? It's a very common question that has been asked by patients as well as our colleagues.
Yes, so we can give COVID vaccines to the patient who has allergic reactions to sulfa or the penicillin. In fact, we have given COVID vaccines to a person, our microbiologist, my hospital's microbiologist, who has severe life-threatening anaphylaxis twice. And we have given 2 doses of COVID vaccine, 28 days apart, and he is fine.
So Anupam is asking, are there any studies to support the claim that immunized people have lesser chance to spread COVID?
Absolutely. So the advantage of immunizing, like generally the half of the patient who has received complete immunization will not have symptomatic COVID. This is number one advantage. Number two advantage, that even though like somebody who has received complete vaccinations and developed COVID infection, they will have a mild symptoms and they will recover very fast without much complications. This is second advantage. And the third advantage is that they will have very low viral load. So they are not going to
Right.
spread their virus to the contacts. So
Right.
this is the advantage of vaccines.
The other question is, does the RT-PCR detect mutants? You have already answered it, but we want to hear again from you.
So you have to look into your RT-PCR report, because RT-PCR report will report 3 genes. One is ORF or the O gene, second is N gene, and third is S gene. So this mutant virus, whether it is a South African or the UK or the Brazilian, you will find that there will be a deletion or the omission of S gene. So S gene will become a negative, and the N gene and the O gene is positive. So when you are reading this report, you should, be very suspicious that you are dealing with the COVID variant infection.
Right. So if there's a gene dropout, then definitely would suspect a variant that is clearly mentioned. Right. Okay. So we are talking about anti-inflammatory, and in the past, in 2020 beginning, SCQS was in flavor, but it has gone out of flavor. So what is the role of SCQS nowadays?
So HCQ has no role as far as the antiviral the activity is concerned, and the question is rightly because HCQ is a powerful anti-inflammatory, but when you look at the duration of action or the timing of or the onset of action, it takes longer time. It is basically used as a disease modifying agents in rheumatoid arthritis and the other collagen disease, where you are giving a prolonged hydroxychloroquine, and then over a period of months, patient will have anti-inflammatory activities of SCQS. And the COVID is an acute illness, acute hyperinflammatory illness, where SCQ is not going to play a role. Here we need a drug which has a very rapid onset of actions, like intravenous corticosteroids like dexamethasone or methylprednisolone or tocilizumab or baricitinib or the anakinra. So if you are using all these rapidly acting anti-inflammatory drugs, then and then you can get the effect for a desired effect in COVID infected patients.
So I think a viral video was, went into the social media regarding some deaths of some colleagues after vaccination. So people might ask, right, to do a CRP level before going to vaccination. So what is your comments upon vaccination-induced deaths? I don't know, but this is quite unscientific. But yes, there are queries from our colleagues as well, and from the patients as well, that people are dying from vaccine and they are quite apprehensive to take vaccines. What is your comment on that?
Absolutely. I think, whatever the life-threatening adverse reactions or the deaths which has occurred after vaccination should be studied genuinely, because it could be a mere simple the vaccine that somebody has received and patient might have some heart attack or some other things from which patient might have died. So I think all the life-threatening complications that has occurred into the India, the government or the appropriate agency should have studied in great detail. Because right now, let me share a patient who is currently admitted under our care. This is a 64-year gentleman who had a COVID in last October, and on March 12 this year, he took his first shot of COVID vaccines. He has no comorbidities, no hypertension, no diabetes, no smoking, no tobacco, nothing. He was absolutely hell and hearty. And in October COVID illness also, like, he do not require oxygen therapy. He was at home isolation and has recovered. Right. So this is his history. And on 12th of March this month, last month, sorry, this is April. So 12th of March, he received the first dose of COVID, and then he has started his office. So on 13th, 14th, he resumed his office work and going daily to the office. On 19th March evening, when he returned from the office exactly after 7 days, he has some guests at home. So while talking to them, he suddenly fell on the sofa. And when he brought to the office, our hospital on the same day, that is on 19th March, he has massive intracranial hemorrhages, which was not in the territory which is we generally called as a hypertensive bleed. He was not having hypertension. It was crossing all over. It was intraventricular. It was in the temporal lobe, in the basal ganglia region, even extending into the occipital region. So it was extensive bleed, and we do not have any risk factor for him. No risk factor. Only there is a temporal association of vaccination that he has received on the 12th March. No risk factors. Past history of COVID in October, and now on 19th March, he had sudden intracranial massive hemorrhage, and probably he is not going to make out.
Dr. Arjun, just one comment on any change in the coagulation guidelines in this new COVID, resurgent COVID, or the same?
Same, sir. Exactly the same. There's no difference. There's no new papers on it. If you see up to date, because it hit back after 2 months, we had all gone into slumber mode. So we all looked it up. Same, no differences.
Absolutely.
One question comes up regarding prophylactic aspirin before vaccine. Any role?
No. Prophylactic aspirin for?
Right. Sometimes people say that people have clots, after vaccine. So let's say, okay, can I take aspirin before that? So I think there's no data to support that we can take aspirin, or we can do CRP in fact, because many people.
That CRP video is actually creating a lot of trouble. That's the problem now when doctors act like we try to become politicians and actors. This is what happens. And actually patients are coming up with CRP values before vaccination, and you really don't know how to answer that. There is no scientific paper which is backing that up except a YouTube video.
Now people are coming with CRP report actually.
CRP report for vaccination.
Yes, so I think this is
I
think
must
difficult.
I must say, Dr. Pankaj, because I am handling this all the vaccination center at Yashoda, every day multiple calls and multiple patients are coming with this CRP report, and they're mentioning that there are a lot of things happening, what to do. My CRP is 0.8 and my CRP is 130. So why can I take the vaccine? Or can I not take vaccine? So any comments, Dr.
Patel? Any genuine? Yes, I'll take. Dr. Patel, any genuine side effects of vaccine that you have seen so far in your patients?
Like I myself had some headache and dizziness, which was lasting for more than 6 hours, with a little bit difficulty in concentration after first vaccine dose. But in second vaccine dose, I don't have anything. And most of my colleagues, they have fever for 24 hours and some body pain and headache, that's it. But we do not have noticed serious side effect.
Right, because people have mentioned that, some...
Who has 2 anaphylaxis.
Yeah.
So we took all the precautions, we have kept everything ready, and we have given him vaccine successfully without any side effects.
So does SK Gupta actually was actually discussing one of the COVID update regarding the neurological complications of Covishield, and we have talked about multiple sclerosis, Guillain-Barré syndrome, transformatitis and all. And I think one audience participant has said regarding Bell's palsy that sometimes after 3 weeks of second dose, the patient had developed Bell's palsy. So I think the real world scenario, I think we wouldn't see these neurological complications with Covishield. I don't know about Covaxin because most of our colleagues actually got Covishield. So I think everybody is fine and they're doing well and they are attending this webinar.
I think the incidence of the prevalence of the Bell's palsy or the Guillain-Barré syndrome or the multiple sclerosis has not increased over the period of time despite the pandemic. And whatever the incidental cases, the people have the tendency to blame it on something, and the nearest and the most important thing that I find is to blame it on the vaccine.
Absolutely.
But I think these reports are unfounded and the data has not supported. And as I said today only, that even the Anthony Fauci had to take it from his colleagues all over the world that whatever he said for the Guillain-Barré syndrome has not been true. And I have my patients of multiple sclerosis who have taken the Pfizer vaccine or the Moderna vaccine successfully without any increase in the activity of the multiple sclerosis or other diseases. So these vaccines, I find them to be very safe. Dr. Atul Patel, may I have your attention, please? You said the vaccines are not harmful. They do not have much of side effects. The question is, how much effect do they have? Like, are they likely to prevent the disease or likely to have retained the antibody for a longer duration of time? Or we are likely to talk about the booster third dose as the Covaxin has already started and they have taken a permission from the government to start the booster dose trial. Where are we heading to?
Yeah, so I mean, the part of your question's answer I have already discussed. So let me repeat it again. That the vaccine generally, we expect that half of the patient who has received full immunization, they will not have a symptomatic or the clinical disease because of their immunization against COVID, number one. The half of the patient, they can get the COVID infections, which may be symptomatic, but the symptoms are generally mild symptoms. When somebody has received a full vaccination against COVID, that is complete 2 dosage. And the third advantage that we expect from a vaccine recipient is that these patients generally have a very low viral load. And as a result of this, they are not going to transmit their infections to their contacts. And regarding the duration of protection and need for the third dose or subsequent booster dose, yes. So whatever antibody response that we have mounted following the complete immunization is going to wane over a period of 3 to 6 months time. So currently we do not know the exact duration, how long the protective or the neutralizing antibody is going to last. But we need to take a booster dose just similar to the influenza vaccine that we generally take every year. So because COVID is likely to be becoming the circulating into the world every year. So we need to probably take the COVID vaccines every yearly, just like the influenza vaccine.
Is it because of the changing variants, or do you feel that it is the
no, because of
wild
waning antibodies? Because these antibodies that we produce following the vaccination, they are going to wane over a period of 3 to 6 months time.
And coming back to your talk from the very beginning, you said that you're going to talk about the antibody titers or the some kits which have been validated. Would you like to qualify what are the kits and where should the people have their antibody testing done to be making sure that they have developed good amount of antibodies?
Yes. So when you are talking about a patient, those who are potential donor for COVID-infected patients for the convalescent plasma, here, like you can go for a regular antibody testing, which may be either nucleocapsid or which could be either the spike protein antibodies. And if you have a good titer of either nucleocapsid or the spike antibodies in a patient who has COVID infections, so you can select those patients who has a very high titer for nucleocapsid or spike protein as a donor for convalescent plasma for the treatment of actual patients. But if you want to test antibodies for a patient who has received Covishield or the Pfizer's or the Moderna vaccine, then you should be very careful that you are ordering laboratory to check for only spike protein IgG and not for the nucleocapsid IgG. Because Covishield, Pfizer or Moderna, will not give you antibodies against nucleocapsid antigen. It will give you antibodies against only spike protein, right? So if you are checking the nucleocapsid, then the titer will be 0 after Covishield vaccine or Pfizer or the Moderna vaccine. But when you have received a Covaxin, which is which is using the inactivated the entire virus genome, here we expect that nucleocapsid as well as the spike antibodies will be produced in a patient who has received Covaxin. So here we do not need to request laboratory specifically that we need to check spike protein. Even if they are doing nucleocapsid, you will probably demonstrate the antibodies against the nucleocapsid antigen.
Any
Right, I
specific
think-
lab which is using a specific kit and which might be more reliable?
So you have to find out with your nearby lab, and you have to inform that, I mean, when you are requesting them for the Covishield efficacy, that please perform only spike antibodies rather than nucleocapsid antibody. Because these are the two different kits. The makers are also different. One is from Roche, nucleocapsid is from the Roche, and the Abbott is producing spike protein, and so on.
Okay, I think most of the things have been answered. Just a few queries regarding the reinfection, because as you already mentioned that if the patient is having COVID and they're reinfected after the vaccine, the disease would be mild and they could be better off with the home isolation and general treatment. So we are not seeing patients again admitted with severe COVID who are already vaccinated.
No, I have not seen a patient who had developed a severe symptomatic COVID after vaccination. But reinfection, we have seen reinfection after the natural infection. So like again, the explanation for reinfection after getting actual COVID is the same. So the even definition of the reinfection is also very important, that if somebody has developed COVID infections, his patient has recovered, and if patient develops symptoms which is consistent with the COVID illness after 3 months of recovery from the first infection, and now the RT-PCR comes positive with symptomatic illness which is consistent with the COVID, then and then you can say that this is a reinfection. Because if you are checking your patient with RT-PCR after 1 month of recovery from that patient, and now patient is complaining of long COVID symptoms, that is fatigue, some breathlessness, and if you are doing RT-PCR, it may come positive, because the dead virus genome which are there into the nasopharynx or the oropharynx, you are going to pick up by RT-PCR. So it will not tell you that this is a live virus. And that's the reason that the definition of reinfection of COVID includes 3 months period. That person has recovered from the prior COVID illness for 3 months time, and now he has new symptoms which is consistent with COVID and RT-PCR positive. Because culture is not possible in our clinical practice scenario.
I think Dr. Vijayaroda must agree that Max Healthcare actually is doing a trial on reinfection, and we are getting data regarding reinfection, and possibly after a year or so, we would get a better idea about what is the outcome of that patient. Dr. Vijayaroda, sir, is this true, sir?
Yeah, it's true, Pankaj. Yes, Max Healthcare has started this trial of patients who have developed reinfection and post-vaccination COVID infection after first dose and after second dose. So we are collecting data, and hopefully within the next 6 months, we'll be wiser enough to answer a few questions and queries regarding the reinfection and the post-vaccination infections.
Right. So two last questions, sir, Dr. Patel, sir, regarding new onset diabetes in COVID.
Yes, so this is very important and interesting, because the COVID utilizes the S receptors, and the pancreas is rich in the S2 receptors. And there are several patients. Initial reports came from the United Kingdom that the patient develops new onset diabetes, and this report was published last year in the NEJM. And this is just because of the islet cell inflammations, because of S2 receptors are there, and COVID produces inflammations or ilitis, and which leads to the diabetes. Even at Ahmedabad also, like we have quite a few patients. When we told them that your sugar is very high and you are diabetic, so this is a surprise to them that I was never diabetic. None of my family member is diabetic, but COVID leads to the inflammations of the islet cells and producing new onset diabetes is very common. And this, the diabetes generally persists for several months.
Right. So the last question would be when we are all eligible for the booster dose of vaccine? 3 months, 6 months, 9 months, a year?
So for that, I think we should wait, because right now the Pfizer is releasing the 6-month data after vaccination, and they claim that the antibody titer in the after 6 months of Pfizer vaccine is good enough. So I think we have to wait for our own Covishield data, and so the future month, like, we'll be able to collect a good knowledge that how long the antibodies will remain once the patient has received full Covishield vaccinations. So what is the waning period of Covishield antibodies after complete vaccination?
So if I have waned my antibody after 6 months, so can I change my vaccine, previous vaccine?
Right now, like, the vaccine interchange is not recommended in most of the countries. That if suppose somebody has received first Pfizer, he cannot take Moderna as a second dose, or Covishield, so we cannot take Pfizer. But once the antibody waning has occurred, so after 6 months, suppose my Covishield antibodies has gone off, and now I can get a Pfizer vaccine, so I can take Pfizer vaccine. Just like influenza vaccine, I can change from the Abbott to the Glaxo to the Sanofi, whatever.
Right. So final comments by Dr. Ruby, and then we'll wind up this session. But Ruby, your comments, and then we'll wind up.
I think it was a wonderful talk and wonderful discussion, almost 2 hours discussion on such a topic, which is still, I mean, a gray, white and area, which is we are learning every day. So, and about the vaccination, definitely there are a lot of, I'm already talking about the hesitancies and eagerness. So both still persist. Because once you see when the age group has been started, like 45, the first day it was a like huge crowd. People are coming, and gradually it is, I mean, they are coming with a bunch of the questions. So I think this will go on, and gradually we all will, I don't know when we will be able to, we will be able to fight this virus, but it should not, I don't have any other words. So it's, I think, thank you very much, Dr. Patel. And with the final comment.
Dr. Patel, may I ask you one question before we wind up? We have talked a lot about the antibodies, but Dr. Rahul Nethani is never happy talking about antibodies without talking about T cells. So,
yeah. No, Rahul Nethani is not, is he here? He always loved the T cells.
Very fond of patrolling T cells. How long do they provide immunity, and like what is you feel their role in the prevention of COVID in the long term?
So again, like, I mean, we need to refill the COVID vaccine booster. So, I mean, we are not sure like how long our Covishield is going to protect us, but we expect that within 3 to 6 months time, the antibodies which are produced after Covishield vaccination will be wane off, and we need to have a booster dose after 6 months time.
So I think thank you very much. Thank you, Dr. Atul, for a wonderful session, and indeed. Thank you, our chairpersons, and Dr. Ashok, over to you for formal vote of thanks.
Yes, sir. Thank you, Dr. Pankaj, sir. And it is my privilege to present a vote of thanks to the gathering. It is very good to hear from Dr. Atul Patel, sir. Sir has spoken wonderfully and without any break for 1 hour, and it's quite interesting to listen him without a blink of an eye. Thank you very much, sir. And I thank all the chairperson, our President, Dr. Vijay Arora, sir, Dr. Satish Gupta, sir, Dr. Ruby Bansal, madam, and Dr. Arjun Khanna for having wonderful discussion and chairing the session. I also thank our scientific coordinator, academic coordinator, Dr. Pankaj Chaudhary, for moderating this session. And I thank all the audience and postgraduate student and delegate and members of the society for being present here for this wonderful CME on this very important pandemic, which came again with the more strength and more powerful way. And definitely we have become some wiser with the opinions of Dr. Atul Patel, and having wonderful discussion among all the panelists and moderation. Thank you very much to all of you. Thanks. Thank you very and good night to all of you. Thank you.
Good night, and thank
Thank
you.
you very much.